second. But what I've learned is if I just start talking, after a while people will wonder what's going on and they'll sit down and then they'll realize that the next session is about to start. And in fact, the next session is even better than the break. The previous group actually set a very high bar, and I have no doubt that the next group will meet and exceed what we're going to hear. I thought the previous panel did a great job in setting up some of the questions in terms of, for example, this question about, who has the burden and what happens with the process? Can one design an institution so that the process works well? And how would that work in Spectrum? So the second session's goal is to start beginning to move in that direction. And let me just say a few words of introduction about our keynote speaker, Gary Marchant, who's a law professor at ASU, and he's also a professor of life sciences. He's also the executive director of the Center for the Study of Law, Science, and Technology. There's a lot more information in here in the bio. One of the things that I was struggling with is I don't know what to be more impressed about. He's got a PhD in genetics, a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School, and a law degree from Harvard. And he's been in private practice, and he's been in academia. And in fact, this is true for actually all the speakers who've gone out of their way to be here today, and I'm very grateful. But in fact, in Gary's case, I actually happen to know that this week he's giving 4 talks in 4 cities. And he's going back to Arizona in between because he's teaching 4 courses at the moment. So we look forward to his comment. And I will just say one more word before he starts. The moderator will be Anna Gomez, who's a partner at Wiley Rein. We're very grateful that she could be here today. Like everybody on our panels today, illustrious service. She's actually been acting administrator at the NTIA. She's worked in industry for Sprint Nextel. She spent 12 years at the FCC, and she's also been at the White House and up on the Hill. And so without further ado, let me hand it over to Gary to give us a keynote speech.
Thanks, Pierre, and thanks to Flatiron Society for inviting me. So I'm going to build on the previous panel, and particularly Professor Boyd's talk, who knows nothing about Spectrum, and neither do I, so we're consistent that way.
Just turn it on for you.
Okay. But also build on his talk on the EPA activities, and specifically focus in on a campaign or attempt by EPA over about the last 2 decades to move from a deterministic or point estimate risk assessment to a probabilistic one. So EPA's had this very extensive attempt to make that transition, and I think that may create some lessons for doing a similar type of transition in the Spectrum context. And some of the issues have already been raised, but I'll go into others. So you already know what risk assessment is, basically try to figure out what hazard would actually result in harm in specific real-world scenarios. Risk assessment and risk management, risk communication in 3 different terms. One of the issues is how much of this decision-making should be in the risk assessment sphere, which is more the technical, analytical, although obviously some policy and uncertainty in there, or the risk management. And part of the move from a deterministic to a probabilistic moves a little bit of the burden from the risk assessors to the risk managers, who are now not just going to get a single point estimate, but are going to now get this much more complex range of possible outcomes that they now are going to have to exercise some additional work on to try to figure out what that means when they communicate it, so how it applies to risk communication. So we need risk assessment. This is a woman who's complaining that jackhammers are disturbing her unborn child, and she's sitting there with a cigarette. So we need to know what are the real risks and what aren't, and so we use risk assessment to try to figure out where the priority should lay. And so I'm going to talk about EPA's use of probabilistic risk assessment, and it's a little bit different than it's used sometimes in the literature. I think what Paul just referred to in the nuclear context, where it's most, and it was originally designed as sort of this fault tree or event tree analysis, where you look at a sequence of probabilities, like this famous one by Rasmussen on nuclear accidents, where you're looking at all these different possibilities of failures, and then what are the probabilities each of those could come, and you get a whole bunch of strings of multiplied probability. And so that was what the word probabilistic risk assessment initially meant. When EPA uses it, they don't do this, really. They do rather things like Monte Carlo, which we've heard about, which is somewhat similar, except instead of using point estimates of each of these inputs, they use a range usually. And so it's a somewhat different animal than this traditional nuclear that's still used in a lot of sort of technological risks where you're basically looking for failure modes and faults that could that could happen to create an accident. So what we're trying to really deal with is two fundamental aspects that are unavoidable about doing risk assessment of variability and uncertainty. And these are different things. Variabilities are variations within the thing you're studying. So for example, if you're studying human risks, men and women may respond differently. You may respond based on your weight. You may respond based on your genetics. So there is that variability, and get more and more data. It's not going to get rid of the variability. It's just a fact of life. It's a certainty that you have to deal with. And then uncertainty is the things we don't know. You know, does this particular chemical cause a certain endpoint, say a reproductive toxicity? What's its dose response model, and how does that relate, and so on. These are uncertainties that maybe with more data we'll eventually learn more and more about, and maybe that uncertainty box will get narrower and narrower over time, but it will never completely disappear. So we talked in the last panel about these National Academy of Science reports that have come out traditionally. The first real major one was this one in 1983 called the Red Book, and it basically told agencies that there's inherently going to be uncertainty in your risk assessment and variability, and you need to figure out how to address that. And one way you can address that is by basically adopting inference options to fill the gaps. The things where you don't have data to answer it, you can adopt an agency, and you should do it in an explicit, open way, inference gaps to bridge those uncertainties and variations, and that these can then serve as defaults in risk assessment. So EPA looked at that, and they've been already working on guidelines, and so they put out a whole bunch of risk assessment guidelines in the 1980s that basically adopted these default assumptions that we're going to assume that the worst result in any animal species will be the one we'll look at for humans. We're going to assume there's a zero threshold in a carcinogen. All these series of assumptions that are built into their risk assessment, and it was driven by lawyers. The risk assessment guidelines were very much driven by lawyers in the 1980s who didn't want to have to litigate or fight over each of these issues over and over again as the EPA is going through all these pesticides and so on. They wanted some continuity, some consistency, so they basically forced the EPA to basically put these as rules. And one of the problems we're going to see is these rules became too rigid, but they basically put in place these assumptions or these defaults. And what EPA did as an agency out there to try to protect the public with a health mission is sort of assumed sort of the worst case, not crazy worst case, but sort of what they term plausible upper bound estimates. So they would basically try to figure out what would be sort of the worst it could be realistically, and then knowing that would be the maximum. Then if it's safe for that, it's going to be safe for everybody. But some of these were kind of crazy. I mean, they assumed, of a community that there'd be someone sitting at the fence line for 70 years for 24 hours a day, and they eventually relaxed that. But initially, it was these pretty extreme worst-case assumptions, but not completely crazy. But the problem is you then multiply them against each other. So this is from EPA. Last year did a big assessment on how this has all been working out, and they basically were very critical of their own deterministic risk assessment method. They said we developed these simplified approaches to characterize risks, even though they're so complex, using basically point estimates for all the parameters and variables in the model. Such an approach typically produces a point estimate of risk. These are called deterministic assessments. As a result of the use of these, what we assumed to be basically worst case, we basically got an output that we really had no real sense of how much uncertainty was associated with that. We would just basically get out a single number, and we do lots of these, and we get all these single numbers. We don't have any sense of how much uncertainty is with that, and what's the span of uncertainty. It might be very different between different risk assessments, but we just get these single numbers. And in last year when they did this assessment, they were saying this was a big problem. And particularly because we use these defaults tended to be worst case. We ended up getting numbers coming out of this that turned out to be not that realistic. And they got a lot of flack in the 80s and 90s and 2000s about these unrealistic assumptions, particularly when they were multiplied and accumulated, that they just weren't really valid in the real world. And so EPA's in last year, again, sort of admitting that. And again, the problem is that you're 95 percentile times 95 percentile, you don't get 95th percentile. Now you're up in 99. And when you have 20 of these, you can get a number that's sort of off the charts crazy. And so an example was the risk number, the potency number that EPA used for formaldehyde, a very commercially important chemical. If that number was true, we'd all have 37 cancers by the time we're 70, just from the formaldehyde we generate by metabolizing food in our own bodies naturally. we'd all be dead many times over, and we're obviously not all dead, so that obviously that number's out of whack, too high. And more of these examples were put forward. Industry obviously harped on these, and EPA started to realize that they had a problem here, that these numbers weren't in the world of reality. Nichols and Zeckheiser wrote an article, a very famous article, called The Perils of Prudence. So basically saying these agency decision makers, the risk managers, the administrators, and the political deputies are given these point numbers, and they have no sense of how much these really relate to the real world and what's the uncertainty around them. And so they're really not in a position to make a sensible risk management decision, because they're just given these unrealistic single point estimates. And this, in a number of articles, got a lot of attention. You had the Office of Management and Budget, the National Academy of Sciences, the EPA Science Advisory Board through the 1990s and the 2000s, really criticizing the EPA for three things. One, they're intermixing their policy judgments with the scientific assessment. They're moving basically a risk management determination of how to deal with uncertainty into the risk assessment. They're basically relying on these two extreme worst case assumptions that accumulate, particularly in multiple ones, and they're failing to basically provide the risk manager a sensible vision of what the uncertainty around these point estimates are. So these three criticisms were over and over again in a whole series of reports over about a 15-year period. An example is the Blue Book by National Academy of Sciences, required by the Clean Air Act, said the uncertainty analysis is the only way to combat the false security of certainty, which is caused by refusal to acknowledge and quantify the uncertainties and risk predictions. So EPA was under a lot of pressure. Their own famous administrator, who served twice in the role, he wrote a very famous article in 1984. We must insist on risk calculations being expressed as distribution of estimates and not as magic numbers that can be manipulated without regard to what they really mean. We must try to display more realistic estimates of risk to show a range of possibilities. To help us to do this, we need new tools for quantifying and ordering sources of uncertainty, for putting them in perspective. So there's a lot of pressure on EPA to do something. And they started looking at different options. One would be to sort of relax some of their conservative assumptions. Instead of 70 years at the fence line, maybe 35 years. Maybe instead of 24 hours a day, maybe 10 hours. And so they started to pull back a little bit on some of the more extreme assumptions. Other people recommend they put in a range of outcomes. The problem is these ranges would, as someone I think mentioned in the last panel, would sometimes be many orders of magnitude, and you didn't know what the likelihood of each of those was, so it wasn't really that useful. There was a big push to create, instead of the worst case assumption, the best estimate, or the mean, or the expected value. A lot of economists like that. The contract with America in 1994 that almost passed, it passed the House and came within one vote of the Senate, would have required agencies to use a best estimate or a mean estimate instead of these worst case assumptions, but that never actually got implemented. And so what was really converged on was this idea of probabilistic risk assessment as a solution to these problems. So what is it? So as EPA described it, it's a group of techniques that incorporate variability and uncertainty in the risk assessment process. It provides estimates of the range and likelihood of a hazard, exposure, or risk rather than a single point estimate. It can provide a more complete characterization of risks, including uncertainties and variabilities, to protect more sensitive or vulnerable populations and life stages. The information obtained from a probabilistic risk assessment can be used by decision makers to weigh the risks of decision alternatives or to invest in research with the greatest impact on risk assessment uncertainty. And so EPA lists what they count as probabilistic risk assessment. And I'm not really sure why expert elicitation is probabilistic risk assessment, but it's always on their list. They always refer to other statistical models, but never say what those are. They do sensitivity analysis sometimes, but mostly they use this thing Monte Carlo analysis. And most of their times they claim they're doing probabilistic risk assessment, they're using Monte Carlo analysis. And what is that? It's basically a tool for combining distributions to produce basically a range. And so if you're basically looking at risk or probability consequence for each of the inputs, you would provide either a probability distribution, a multi-choice variable, or binary choice. So for example, if one of the issues, if it's man and woman, 50% be man, 50% women. Other times you'd have a distribution. And basically the computer, and this is really made, enabled by the availability of computers much more frequently, it just does these random samples or draws from each of these boxes, each of the inputs. And so if it's a 50-50, half the time it'll draw a man, half the time a woman. If it's a distribution, it would basically draw proportionally to where the frequency of the distribution, and then it combines those to produce a risk estimate, and does these thousands of times. Some of them are 10,000 or even more, and then it basically charts that in a graph and shows you a range of possible outcomes and their possible frequencies. So this is from an EPA report basically showing you could do central tendency or high-end value. So this is the deterministic risk assessment they've been doing up until now. And you take a single number for each of those inputs that can either be the mean or the upper value. They usually use the upper value, and you get a single number. With the Monte Carlo, what they'll do is they'll take these ranges and they'll randomly sample that, each of those each time through, and you get at the end not a single number, but basically a graph that basically shows the range and the possibilities of the outcomes. And so you can see that 95th% population level risk is way down at the end. The vast majority of times it's to the left of that, but some are over on that far end. And so the question is, as a risk manager, you're then presented with this rather than a number. And it's your decision now of where you want to be on that. How comfortable do you feel? Is it worth it going way out on that extreme? What's that risk here if we were to get it right or wrong? Or should we move more towards central tendency? Again, it may depend on the specific facts of the case, what's at issue, and so on. But this gives you a lot more information than just getting that single number of where the real world likely lies. And so EPA's, over the last 15 years, it just one report after another sort of pushing this. This is their policy for use of this in 1997, their guiding principles in 1997, their process for conducting probabilistic risk assessment in 2001, their probabilistic risk assessment method and case studies report last year, their frequently asked questions on risk assessment. There's a bunch of others as well. And so in all these reports, they're basically pushing agency managers and risk assessors to move towards probabilistic risk assessment. Strongly encouraging it, but never mandating it. Never saying you must do this, just saying this has a lot of benefits and you should really try to use this when you can. So they say things like, it is one way to characterize the insertion associated with any risk assessment as part of decision analysis. The enhanced use of this would allow EPA decision makers opportunity to assess uncertainty pertaining to its effect on decisions and explore the defensibility of the available risk management options through a more robust and transparent process. Most often, risk managers want to know if better understanding of uncertainties might support a different decision alternative or provide further support for the selected decision. And they basically outline why is this beneficial. You're basically giving a more realistic and robust representation of the world. You're providing greater transparency to both the risk managers and to the public and the stakeholders. You avoid the distorting effect of compounding conservative defaults. You're shifting more of the judgment from the risk assessor to the risk manager and putting more of the responsibility on the manager. And then you're also basically telling where can you get more information? Where would it make sense to maybe spend some more money to get more data to fill in gaps? Where would it really make a difference in this graph you get at the end? But they also recognize there's a lot of challenges. A clear institutional understanding of how to incorporate the results of this is lacking. It requires a different skill set. Probably the most important concern they talk about is communicating this to the decision makers is very complicated. It's much more complicated than just giving a simple number, as well as with the stakeholders. And so it basically makes it more complicated. They're admitting that. They're saying that's going to make it more complicated. And they then have quite a bit of analysis in their reports, sort of looking at this issue, how it's actually working. It requires, particularly this problem of communication is the one problem they really emphasize. Risk assessors are responsible for sharing information on probabilistic risk so that risk managers have a clear understanding of the uncertainty and variability and how this affects the risk management decision. Clear communication between the risk assessment team and the decision maker is essential in aiding the decision maker's understanding and use of the results. So they're basically saying the risk assessors really have to help the risk manager understand what this actually means here. They go on to say the lack of familiarity presents a challenge for both the decision makers, the risk managers, and the public. Many view this as a highly technical discipline that uses sophisticated mathematics and requires extensive training to apply and understand. I was actually at a public meeting when I was in private practice for a facility in California, and the EPA came and talking. They put up a bunch of quadratic equations. You just see the audience just die, right? I mean, they just completely blank out. I mean, that's it. There's no more public input after that point. Single point estimates are easier to grasp for most people based in part on familiarity with this approach over the history of EPA. Although some people initially have difficulty interpreting probability distributions, everyone has a common baseline experience of this from your odds of winning a lottery and weather forecasting. And this experience could be used to frame the discussion of results. It's not necessary to understand the underlying mathematics or even to include results as full distributions. Results can be distilled down to the critical essence or decision-making meaningful input of interest. So they're basically trying to deal with this problem and try to suggest that you can get on with it. I like to quote Aristotle here, it is a mark of an instructed mind to rest satisfied with the degree of precision which the nature of the subject permits, and not to seek an exactness where only an approximation of the truth is possible. We can't get a precise number. Doesn't make sense. It might be nice to have a precise number. The risk manager might want a precise number, but that's not the way the world is. And so even though it's difficult, even though it's messy, we have to try to give them the range. It's often hard to calculate risk. This is a story from Canada where I'm from. Sister hits moose on the way to visit her sister who hit a moose. So you never know what the risk can be. So in conclusion, EPA for about a 20-year period has made a pretty concerted effort to shift from these deterministic risk assessment to probabilistic risk assessment. They've made quite a bit of strides. A lot of their programs are now using this, not every time, but fairly routinely. They've pushed it pretty heavily from the top down, but have never actually required it. They just recently did their own self-evaluation of 16 case studies where they've used it in different programs and said that basically it was pretty favorable. What was sort of interesting in several of the case studies, it basically came out the exact same place the deterministic risk assessment did in terms of the risk management decision, but at least the manager had that extra knowledge. And then there continues to be strong outside pressure on EPA to continue this transition to this from the OMB, from NRC, from the Science Advisory Board. I was looking for some published articles criticizing this and I couldn't find any. I found about 30 saying they should do more of this, but none being critical. So for the outside scientific community seems to be pushing them more and more in this direction as well. So just to conclude, it is about risk. It's going to end badly. We have to get used to that. And EPA, I think, is trying to make this move in a sensible direction and making some progress, but it's not simple. And this complexity in how to communicate that is the major challenge they're encountering. Thank you.
Okay, so are we on? We're on, okay. Hi, everyone. Just a reminder, I'm Anna Gomez. I'm with the law firm of Wiley Rein. I'm pleased to moderate this next panel of very impressive, I am sure articulate folks. So this next session is now more about, okay, so how is this implemented in the regulatory environment? So very much appreciate Professor Marchant's remarks. To introduce our panelists, Giulia McHenry, sitting right next to me. She's the former associate at the Brattle Group. She's an economist, a PhD economist, and will be joining NTIA in about a week as chief economist. Where I am sure she will be doing spectrum issues and will start pushing the introduction of PRA or QRA to violate the rule. She wanted me to make sure that I stress that she's here in her individual capacity and is not speaking on behalf of NTIA. Giulia, can you give us what your perspective is on the issues that we've been discussing today?
Sure. I think, well, like Tom Power, I'm maybe a little less. I feel like I'm at level 0 here on QRA. So I'm certainly here trying to learn as much as I can. But I think the first few takeaways that I have is flexibility, which is something not inherent to QRA, but something when we start thinking about bringing it into spectrum, I think going forward, thinking about flexibility when looking at quantitative risk assessment. So accepting that we don't have all the answers now, accepting that there are future unknowns we aren't even aware of yet, and accepting that whatever decisions we make, there is a reasonable likelihood of ex post new problems that we never expected. There has to be some flexibility. And so the question then becomes, how do we incorporate new information into an existing QRA sort of as we move forward? And I think setting up a framework for that is important. The other thing is that, I think risk exists, right? And the risks are always there, and on some level we've been dealing with them, and policymakers have been dealing with them in spectrum all the time. This is just offering potentially a new framework to be looking at risk in a slightly different way, and in a way that might allow us more flexibility, back to that word, in terms of how we use it going forwards in spectrum and looking at spectrum sharing more in the future. So I think I'll stop there, but that's sort of my perspective so far.
Excellent. Our next speaker is Shawn Jackman. He is the CEO of Clinical Mobility, which he founded to develop a certification program to increase reliability and safety of wireless. Yeah. So that's very on point, I think, here.
Yeah. I think I'm not a lawyer. I'm sort of you can call me one of the geeks in the room, I guess. Have the engineering background. Oh. And great comment on the previous session that, the lawmakers are making all the decisions, and the engineering, folks need to have more of a voice. And I said, oh, really? Oh, we're gonna get there. That sounds great. I have a practitioner's perspective. I'm probably the only healthcare guy in the room. Last 7 years, I was in charge of wireless design standards for one of the largest healthcare systems in the U.S. And not only did I develop the standards, but I had to live with those decisions, which I think taught me a lot. And I participate, actually co-chair a task force with AAMI. It's a healthcare regulatory body trying to do something about this, with trying to help healthcare organizations and device vendors and people who make this stuff to have better success, to really get to better reliability and safety. It's a long road doing that through regulatory bodies. So I left my gainful employment to fill a void and to try to make a dent in this.
Did you take a risk?
I actually took a very calculated risk. I probably didn't do a full PRA on this, but I'm very excited to be here, and I love the passion, with people in the room, and that's what gets me up in the morning, and it's always a pleasure to be part of that.
All righty, thank you. And next we have Susan Fox. Susan is Vice President of Government Relations at Walt Disney, and we're also a former colleague from the FCC, and of mine and of Tom's. So Susan, tell us about your perspective.
Yes, so I thought, being in the academic atmosphere, and being a former colleague of Anna and a bunch of folks at the FCC, trying to take it up a level and trying to figure out how should the agency be approaching a lot of these questions, and whether trying to do a better job of risk assessment. And I think I love the notion and that there could be a greater degree of rigor within particularly spectrum decisions and within commission decisions generally, because the commission is generally a function of compromise. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think one of the fact that, and I hear from speakers this far, I love the fact, or maybe it's curious, that the context in which a lot of this rigor has been applied, and where there's significant risk and taking risks, we're talking about EPA, we're talking about fundamental health, we're talking about nuclear reactors. We deal with, I deal with TV and video, but we can't seem to figure it out there. Spectrum, obviously now as we proceed, we're dealing with pretty important spectrum questions as it evolves into healthcare. But it does seem as if we've almost got the cart before the horse, that we should have maybe experimented with a little of these things with a little fewer repercussions for our life and safety. So I do have, and we'll get back to this later as we dig in, some fundamental concerns about the ability, and I say this with the ecosystem generally, of an agency that's born of compromise and an industry that's grown up around it, for better or worse, as part of that compromise environment, whether this approach could be successful, for not whether it should be, but whether there are practical impediments.
Yeah, I'd like to, in your slide where you talked about how there was a sense for the agency to introduce the policy piece into what should be really a technical analysis. And I think we have a little bit of that at the FCC. And for us, really, also, it's how you introduce the political perspective into what is a very fact-based analysis. And in thinking about that, when I read the materials, the idea of doing the quantitative risk assessment analysis reminded, in order to advise the commissioners on the actions or the decisions they should make in particular proceedings, whether it be spectrum or anything else at the commission, reminded me a little bit of the way the general counsel of the FCC advises the commission. I don't think it's quite as complicated as the engineering analysis required for a spectrum decision, but it's the same idea in that the general counsel's office at the FCC will say to the commission, here's what you're thinking about doing, here is the litigation risk associated with that, here's the likelihood of an adverse decision in that litigation risk, and then the commission makes its decision. It can decide to ignore whatever that litigation risk assessment was, or it can adjust how it makes its decisions based on that litigation risk analysis. Other agencies with which I have worked have a different view of their general counsel's advice. Their general counsel's advice is, no, you can't do that, it's illegal. Not always, I shouldn't say it that way. Yes, you can do that, it's legal. There isn't this litigation risk matrix that you could utilize, which I think, to me, makes it more difficult for the regulator to be innovative. Would you say that doing this type of risk assessment enables more innovative decision making? I will throw it out to the group.
I do, because sometimes we talk about, from a scientific standpoint, the assumptions that go into generating value. I mean, I've looked at these reports citing, an outcome, and I go, wait, how did you get there? And you go back and then you go, we have a problem here. But not enough people are asking that. And I think what this way I perceive this is. And you quantified it quite well, that a lot of independent variables, a lot of ranges of those, and we have to dimension the problem as much as we can, because those assumptions, when it goes to the risk manager or the policymaker who's making the decision, a lot of things are hidden from them. Mm-hmm. And this transparency, what an engineer lives by, and a scientist, the good ones, I would argue, live by, is transparency of that information and clearly articulating those assumptions right up front that went into that model, and that's powerful. And I love the fact that you couldn't find any arguments against it. I said, okay, so you're in agreement. I would take.
Yeah, I think it's a good move. I mean, I think it's really eye-opening. Like some of the EPA case studies, I mean, what they basically did is, this is where they normally come out, and they do the Monte Carlo, whatever, and they find that there's almost nobody out there, right? It's just way out there, and really all the people's risk is way over here, and so they don't have any problem of hitting the regulation here. There's really nobody out here. It's just a hypothetical, made in a computer person. There's no real people out here, and so why would you regulate out there when it's not going to really do any benefit at all? Other times they find, it might be, there's one of their case studies was children in the playground equipment where they coat it with copper and arsenic and so on. They find, there is some real kids out there. It's not that many, but there is real kids. And they said, we don't want to put any kids at this risk, so we're going to regulate way out here. But they can make that on a case-by-case determination after eyeballing it and seeing what's at stake. And that just gives so much more, I think, flexibility to make a sensible, realistic decision.
I think adding on that, the nice thing about a matrix is it does, I think we're getting close to, but sort of not really talking about the cost-benefit analysis too, right? So having that matrix approach allows us to start to think about integrating a cost-benefit analysis with some sort of QRA, because I don't think that, obviously Rostin has way more information on this than I do, but I do think they're integrated pieces, and I don't think we can make good policy decisions without looking at both together. So starting with this matrix sort of leads to having policymakers be able to look at more of a cost-benefit approach.
Which leads me to my next question, which is practically speaking, because I do have a hard time seeing really the commissioners with matrices in their offices making decisions. I can see them having a recommendation from whatever the office is, whether it's Julie or the Wireless Bureau or the International Bureau, coming up and saying, here is the decision that we made. Here, by the way, is our matrix. But I really don't see them having the time to dig through the amount of analysis that we talked about. Certainly not 28 years of analysis, if that's ever comes to that.
Yeah, one of the fundamental questions I've thought about with spectrum, and it devolves to the commission context, is that it strikes me that a lot of these analyses demand a strong administrator to get the data, the correct inputs, and so that the data that's being inputted isn't finessed one way or the other. I think that's, I'm looking at Julie, and I'll probably look at Julie all hour, but that is certainly a function that I see Julie doing, in all honesty, driving that sort of analysis and demanding that level of rigor from the industries that come before the agency, which is, Chairman, all of us is often lacking that level of real, actual data. But when it gets to, with a 5-member commission, it is more challenging because the questions become more diffuse. And that I've wondered with respect to the FDA or the EPA, whether that has been, strangely enough, almost more easy to adopt this approach because it's a different structure of an agency.
Although, EPA is very decentralized. There's all these different programs with all these different managers all making decisions. And so, it's not like it's the administrator making the decision, or maybe in the FCC, it's the 5 commissioners who in the end make the decision. So there's maybe even a smaller ultimate decision-making body in the FCC. I don't know. I just think it just sounds like, from my sense of it, and the EPA report sort of says that, you don't have to explain all the data and the calculations and so on. You just give the visual. And we are very visual people. And when you can see that chart and that distribution, and you say, where should we draw that line? It's much easier than having, a bunch of calculations or just having one number where you have no idea where that was generated from and what it really means. It does seem that what EPA is trying to say is that, we do see it actually being useful to our risk managers to have that nice chart and see where to draw the line. And it's very arbitrary. It's very, ambiguous where you draw that line. But what's interesting from a legal perspective is when EPA departs from its old deterministic ways, if they depart from that, they get sued every time. Here, they now have to make a judgment. And they've never been sued for a probabilistic risk assessment judgment because there's no rules. It's basically the discretion of the decision maker. And so they actually have more freedom and less risk of being sued by having that flexibility than if they had to follow sort of a rule book, cookbook rules.
I think my brain just exploded.
Basically, when you put a bunch of decision-making criteria down on paper and then you basically have to follow that as an agency, right? You're now stuck by that. But if it just says, exercise your judgment on, where is a reasonable place to draw that, there's no basis to sue you as unreasonable because the judge will look at it and say,
Question their judgment so much more. It's
right.
like,
yeah.
And then FCC context, making the broadcast ownership questions or decisions are hard because at the end of the day, making a predictive judgment, whereas if they have some greater rubric of analysis they can point to for APA review, they've got a better.
Right, so your point is that they're not challenged because they have, they're going to get more deference because they've done such a strict analysis versus they can't be sued because it's not.
No, the judge would basically have to second guess their judgment. And they know that that's not the judge's role, it's the commissioner's role or the EPA administrator's role. But when they basically violate their own rule, if they put down these very detailed rules of that they'll apply this model or they'll apply this assumption in this case, and they ever depart from that, they get sued. Because the judge can look at their rules that are 80 pages long and say, aha, you violated this thing that you said you'd do. But when it's basically you're going to exercise a judgment on this range, it's just as easily for the commissioner to do it as the judge, and the judge's not going to second guess the person whose job it is to do that when there's no reason to believe they've gone outside the bounds of their discretion.
So in terms of the process and participation by stakeholders, at what point do stakeholders participate in the process of the development of these assessments?
Yeah, so, and again, I think that, I don't know a lot about the communications world, but I wonder if it's easier in the communications world, that you basically, when you do EPA things, there's a lot of environmental groups, but also just communities, particularly if it's a local, so a lot of the places that are doing this probabilistic risk assessment are Superfund sites where they go and have meetings in the community. These are people who are drinking water or breathing air or whatever, that's the soil that's going to affect them and their children. They're very worried about this, very concerned. They don't understand any of this stuff. And so it's a very big challenge when you come in and say, we've done a Monte Carlo analysis and this, what is it, the eyes glaze over. And so you have to, in the EPA, deal with the general public, I think, a lot more than maybe the spectrum. I mean, the spectrum obviously affects everybody, but does the general public get that involved? Isn't it more an expert community who maybe can understand this stuff better than, the housewife is worried or the family that's worried about their kid, digging in the dirt with some chemical in it?
Or the jackhammer with the guy that was pregnant. That was great.
Yeah, I meant stakeholders as in companies and those that are affected, those that have an interest in the proceeding and are going to want to challenge or make sure that the analysis reflects their reality.
Or maybe their version of reality that they want to try to, and that's the part of that I get frustrated with is money and politics drive, the most of the decisions around here, and it's, I look at the carriers and what's going on, the wireless carriers that taking the 5 gigahertz spectrum for LTE unlicensed or LAA, whatever the variant is, and they pay a lot of money for dedicated spectrum to do what they want to do, and there's a history of you probably remember the advertising campaigns of Wi-Fi being well, that's the enemy. No, just buy our stuff. We'll take care of you, and then even their like the LTE protocol, they're trying to write in the regulations and the 3GPP that only carriers can use this protocol. Yet now they want to take the spectrum away from the unlicensed users for, let's say, enterprises, healthcare organizations, the Nuclear Regulatory Committee and I get concerned that if they get involved too early in that and they start setting the ranges of those variables, who's policing it? And that's and that's clarity of answer to that. I don't know. He kind of sunk down in his chair.
Yeah, he's preparing for his panel.
Policing the range of values that go into that based on some rationale, scientific rationale is, I guess, my point.
Right.
And this gets to the question of burdens, right? So going forward, where should the burdens lie? And this is where I wish I had I have a relatively short history in spectrum. So, sort of thinking past that a little bit, but I think there might be examples where those burdens have fallen to the carriers and where you end up with a scenario where you have sort of pages and pages and pages of regulatory filings within a proceeding where everybody's hired their economists and their engineers to put in there, and then you fight over whose is best. But then there is potential, I think, for an approach where maybe there is a government agency who some funding available, that if a carrier or some other stakeholder wants an analysis done, maybe they can look to a third party to do it. Obviously, the biggest issue there is funding, but I do think there is I have no idea what the right answer is, but there is this question of incentives and who the right stakeholder to do, where the burden lies, both to pay for it and to do the analysis.
What's interesting you say that because it made me think, and I know you're not speaking on behalf of NTIA, but there is a laboratory out in NTIA that probably could do that kind of analysis, but she didn't say it, I did. But we also in the last session talked about the National Science Foundation, I think it was, that conducted that kind of, it was more of an assessment post-assessment, if I remember correctly. But there are certainly organizations out there, but it really does raise the question of
expertise and ability to conduct these analyses both within the agency and outside of the agency. And I don't know how to answer that question other than to say that implementing something like this as a regulatory means will take some time in order to staff up and become experts. The FCC TAC, oh gosh, I know I'm not supposed to use those acronyms and I forgot what it stands for, Technological Advisory Committee, did I get that right? Advisory Council, thank you. Gave some recommendations on steps to take in order to do that, but it's a long-term solution. It's certainly not going to happen overnight. But to push back on you a little bit, Shawn, it is true, and as an attorney that has a lot of clients that participate in proceedings, they do try to advocate for their own benefit. But in order to survive an APA challenge, there has to be the ability for stakeholders to get their input into a proceeding and for the FCC to take their points of view into account. That's not necessarily so in a company.
Yeah.
And you have lived in a company environment where you've tried to introduce this type of analysis. And how did that go?
Yeah, it feels like the example when you were, when the EPA would walk in a meeting and start throwing up all these charts and calculus and the eyes roll over. And, I would get the comment, I mean, it's by the way, we're dealing with a very educated audience in here, right? And it's very refreshing. In the corporate world, it's sort of, well, it's just wireless, Shawn. I mean, I have an AP at home. I mean, what's the problem? So, you start building, and you have to literally educate them at the most basic of fundamentals, and they don't have the background in it. And it's not a knock on them. They're very good at what they do in other areas. This is just a whole different realm. And so I found myself, dealing with, some of this was very tactical and, self-serving to some degree of trying to put some spectrum policies in place for an organization, because you have technologies you put out and different stakeholders and people deploying these things, and like, hey, wait a second. We can't put two systems in the same building that use the same frequencies. We're going to have to coordinate, and so try to put together and go through all of the, in a 180,000 person company to try to institute a new policy framework is not always fun, but it was so needed, and I because I participated in a bunch of industry groups and say, hey, I'm sure some of you have done this. Have you, the corporations? And go, yeah, we thought about that. That'd be a good idea. Let me know how that goes. Like, okay. Then I keep going around. Then I say, gosh, I don't see any in that group. So I just pick up the phone and start calling, and they start. And I couldn't find anybody that was really doing, like, even spectrum management. For those of you that may be less familiar with wireless, if your cable is bad, when you connect your computer to that projector, what do you expect that the quality of that signal is going to be in the end? Right? There's this model in networking, you have physical layer, right? That's your physical cabling. In wireless, what's your physical layer? What's your cabling? It's radio frequency. Well, managing that, gosh darn it, it's really important. And it's not a hardline rule. I mean, you can't be off on this side of the spectrum. For your examples, that it's, you can't have any interference. You have to have one person dedicated to it. Well, that's not necessarily the truth, right? It really does depend. I mean, there's so many things that were elegantly put into these protocols where they can cohabitate. But inside of an organization, I mean, it's really tough because you spend, I found I spent probably half my time just educating of why I was asking, I'd educate to get their approval to go do something. And that's what common everyday life felt like.
But eventually you succeeded.
Sometimes you take them out the parking lot and rough them up a little bit, right? Yeah, but
We're not talking about roughing up the commissioners. FYI.
Not at all. Really good people and very reasonable at the end of the day. As long as you just have to convince them where they see the value, the value out of it. But yeah, most of the time it did go well. It just takes insane amounts of time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Gary went through the timeline of the initial, what was it, what did you say, 1981?
7 was their first policy on it.
Right.
And to say that we are going to now start doing this, they said in 1997 with an official policy from the administrator, and it's now almost 20 years later and still not universal by any means. Yeah.
Although I query whether, I understand, decision may take a long time, but I query whether in the commission's impatience and all of our collective impatience for decisions, sometimes more time wouldn't have been better. I mean, one of the biggest compromises that I've seen in our world was in the late 90s with the DTV standard. It came together, and this was before my time, but since the Grand Alliance was a compromise. And it was the DTV standard was set, and we're still arguing about whether it was the right decision 20 years later. And there are decent, and reevaluating that today, very reasonable people. But maybe at that time it would have been wise to slow down and do a little more actual data-driven analysis that looked at the different inputs going in. Because some of those, if it's not the necessary, I'm not saying, but if there's the avenues down which if you get to the wrong decision quickly, there's avenues that's okay, but there's avenues that's also not the best outcome either. And certainly when you're dealing with health and safety, I'd put that at the top of the list.
Right.
So Gary, who have been some of the noticeable winners and losers in this use in the agencies that you've studied?
Real people have been the winners. I mean, so the thing is that basically what EPA did, EPA isn't being less protective. They're just not protecting imaginary people. And they're not wasting money protecting imaginary people that don't exist. And in some cases, they basically are seeing, like the arsenic treated wood, that they actually should be a little bit more protective because there are some kids out there who are being exposed at high levels. And so it's basically helping them to perform their mission, which is to protect public health better, but actually saving money in not regulating phantom risks. And so when it works wonderfully. There are examples where it doesn't work so well, that it basically costs a lot of money, the managers get all confused, people get frustrated, the stakeholders don't understand. So, not all their case studies were completely positive, but many of them were. And the agency, top brass is totally committed to this. I mean, they are clearly saying this is the way we need to go because it works. And we've been doing it in hundreds of examples now, and it works most of the time. And so, they started slow, and maybe that's what the FCC needs to do with some pilot projects or something. The other interesting thing the EPA does is they say, we're not saying everything has to be a probabilistic risk assessment. That takes some resources. And I didn't get into this, but they basically have an idea that you do a screening thing perhaps first, really quick and cheap, and you sort of just get a sense, because if that screening analysis shows that whatever the activity is safe, you don't even need to bother doing a probabilistic risk, you're fine. Or if it's something really sensitive, like a minority community near a power plant that raises a lot of concerns, or children, a very susceptible, vulnerable population, you might just want to go with the worst case, deterministic. And so they basically have lists of things that maybe these shouldn't be probabilistic, but then all these other ones could be. And so at lunch today, the dean was talking about how, it might be quite tolerable to have your Fitbit or whatever, have 10% of the time not syncing up, but not the airplane coming in, right? So could you look and say, well, here's some areas where we're willing to tolerate a little bit more risk, and say, could we try this methodology here, and will it save money and will it save resources?
So Susan would say, changing how 142 million households get television
That's a big one.
could be a high risk endeavor versus, right. I don't know. I'm not sure what the other side is, but so what would you say is the result of not having done a more quantitative analysis?
So, I don't know. So I won't know, and on query whether we would have come to a different place. I certainly know, and Giulia knows this, not all our channels worked as well as we would have liked. And certainly that was something my company went through. I think it's bizarre in the video space, or fascinating in some ways, that it's all anecdote driven. There's no bell curve. Every 6 months, at least in my world, someone mentions the Heidi game, which in 1968, and some traffic manager at NBC turned off the Jets-Raiders game and put on Heidi. and literally all the time, like, oh, viewers. So there's this notion of the, when that happens in the video space, there was such a high expectation that it will work, for better or worse. So when it doesn't, whether that's odd because they're used to, whether they've accepted a level of environmental risk, but man, when their TV doesn't work, all hell breaks loose. I don't know. But it is very anecdote-driven instead of bell curve-driven.
But it does
Especially when it's football games on.
But I'm so glad you raised that, the fact that you don't have to use it for every single analysis, because that does sound daunting to me and almost impractical. Because then it gets me to a cost-benefit question of is it really worth putting that kind of effort in? So that's very interesting. All right, I got one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. And I think you might maybe already answered it, but Congress often likes to impose certain types of analyses on regulatory agencies. And the one I'm thinking about specifically is the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Anybody who's worked at the commission knows about the IRFA and FERFAs. And basically under the act, federal agencies must analyze the impact of their proposed rules on small entities. And if it's going to have a substantial impact on a large number of them, I'm paraphrasing, then they have to think of alternatives. And it's an analysis that they have to do in every single order. Now, some might allege that analysis is done after the regulatory decisions have been made. And it usually leads to, no, there's nothing else that we could have done, so there it is. How do we avoid something like that happening here, where all of a sudden you're doing these quantitative risk assessments that are really done in order to support a particular
How do I
decision?
manufacture my outcome?
It becomes reverse engineering.
And Gary, I think you might have said it, or maybe no, Susan. You need a strong administrator.
Yeah.
You can't just impose it and layer it over the already existing.
And policymakers need to listen to the science and the engineering behind it. And maybe I just have a tainted perspective, but I have a lot of observations that I've made in my life is that doesn't always seem to be the case, and that's that's sad, right? And we have to give science the right level of attention and voice and an influence in those decisions.
So one question from the outside, this is really a question, I don't know if this make it any better, but if we think about a risk assessment as a multi-step process, right, so that it's not something you can do once the decision is made, but it becomes a way to make the decision, right? So, start small, do a sort of relatively straightforward, simple, cost-efficient or inexpensive cost analysis, or and then start down the road, so that I think one concern is that you get to the end, you've made a decision where you've really factored in this risk assessment, but it's like not transparent enough. Mm-hmm. But if you have a multi-step approach, that allows for that transparency and maybe for the public to be aware as you go through, which may at least not make it look like it was the whole analysis was done, manufactured to get to the right answer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I also, Pierre said at lunch, look for the winners and losers, and no doubt there'll be winners and losers to some extent, but on the other hand, there's also a possibility for win-win-win solutions here, because I see that at EPA. I see that, I went and looked at the public comments that they've had now. I think 3 times they've asked for public comments on this probabilistic risk assessment. So I'm looking for the environmentalist comments against it. They're not against it. They see a benefit for them because they have been undercutting, and they know there's not a lot of credibility if they have these risk numbers that are completely off the wazoo, that get made fun of, that people poke at, and that aren't really protecting any real people. They are concerned about protecting real people. So if they see it being done in a responsible, reasonable way and making sure they are protecting these vulnerable populations, they actually like it, and they're not objecting to it. Industry likes it. Industry doesn't want to pay money to protect non-existent people. The EPA likes it because it is enhancing their credibility with their stakeholders. So that's a win-win-win. And so there's no reason to manipulate it, or, maybe I'm too idealistic, but it does seem like there's some real opportunities to have better decision-making using these kind of tools that is in everybody's interest. Because in the end, on some things, we agree. We have the same basic goals. We want to save money and protect people. And if we can do that together, then if a tool allows us to do that, there's no one's going to lose on that.
All right, with that in mind, let's go to the audience, and we need to follow the wiser rules. So is there a student? No one's looking up. Oh, here we go. Oh, that's the microphone.
Got to answer a question now, though.
Hi, I'm Vicki Stubbs. I'm getting my master's in information communication technology. Given that to start a risk assessment, you have to first prioritize what you think the risks are, and that the loudest voice in this often seems to be industry. How do you suggest the commission prioritize what risk is, and is the public's perception of what their wants are using technology, how would that be taken into consideration?
I guess that kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier about what is harmful interference, right? Does anybody want to take that?
So I would say the commission should, often industry is the proxy for either in the spectrum wars, the viewer, the user, subscriber, whoever it may be. And even public interest groups are imperfectly designed to assess that. I would say my first sense is that the whoever at the commission or whatever point person there is, really presses industry for the data and visibility into the data that's brought before them. As opposed to what often happens in our world is if there's 10 megahertz of spectrum to be split up between rivaling industries, both of us say we want all 10 megahertz, and the commission picks a number and splits it up, and everybody's sort of unhappy and sort of happy, but goes away and lives to fight another day. So I would say that you've got to somehow get through whatever the proxies to say what is the actual interference, what is the science behind it, beyond just sort of the broader allegations.
Yeah, and maybe you want to add one comment to that too. It's there's sort of layers of detail here, and once you make a decision, and I'll just go right off of your example where you say, let's say there's 10 megahertz, I want all of it, but maybe the compromise is you have 5 megahertz here, 5 megahertz there, and but then the next question is can we regulate or maybe advise or guide the people implementing products that are actually going to use it to conform to a certain type of communication protocol. There's this one kind of an archaic method where it's called a continuous duty transmitter, so it just never stops. It's like, think about an alarm that's going off that it just never shuts up. So when two things need to communicate, or you have a lot of things need to communicate through one central point, you need to have this coordination, and it's, we have to listen before talk. It's this fair use of spectrum. There's perhaps one way is say with this spectrum, we have to have maybe a listen before talk type of use, a protocol use of that spectrum, because that allows more, maybe even two systems using the same spectrum to cohabitate, not just say 5 megahertz here, and really by way of engineering designer decisions, really shoot ourselves in the foot. That then, once people start adopting it at scale, then what do you do? You can't. It's hard to go back on that. Well, I already have too much of that already out there. Mm-hmm. Who's going to replace it for me?
But I think
I'm done.
I think this also gets the question of making sure we're looking at all the full set of risks that we can be aware of at any moment in time. But that then also gets to how do we react when we find new risks after the decision's been made. So this, I think that this again gets to the flexibility, right? So there are going to be ex post, as Peter Tenhula would suggest, a number of different possible outcomes that of groups that turn out to be affected that we've never sort of been aware of. And so finding a way to ex post deal with that, I think, is going to be important to implementing this. I would also say that putting in place ex ante a process for dealing with those interference issues ex post would also provide the incentive, potentially, in ex ante, there's really more incentive to, regardless for the decision maker, to be looking across the board at all of the potential risks, not just the guys who can afford to come up to Washington and meet with the FCC.
That's a good point. All right, any in the back? Where's the microphone? Yeah.
I'm Eric Schaefer. I'm a patent attorney, and I wondered if you had any insights on anticipating the risk for disruptive technologies, because it seems like the government is always a couple steps behind in terms of regulating it. The Patent Office is still trying to figure out internet-based inventions, and I remember when the FCC put a lot of emphasis on putting the spectrum together for low-power TV, and then cable access came along and just made it useless.
So back to the future a little bit of put our future-leaning hats on. What were you going to say? I'm sorry, Shawn.
No, I was trying to clarify the question. So what's the...
How do you take into account disruptive innovation after you've already made the decision, correct? Yeah. And I think that's Julie's life. This is a very Julie-oriented session. I apologize. Julie Knapp, you'll be hearing from him very soon, is the head of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC, and he's constantly trying to clean up the last decision that he made.
And you're in the private sector now.
I'm going to pay for that one. But it's a really interesting question. I mean, how do you anticipate that there's going to be something new that's going to disrupt things? And I don't.
Especially in our command and
I don't think
control,
I'm smart enough for that.
Auction is, or spectrum is auctioned off.
Right.
It isn't a terribly. You can't adjust things very quickly. It's by its very nature, and expectations get built into that. Dale's got an idea. There we go. Dale.
You gotta wait for the mic.
Well, it still works.
We're talking about one very important part of spectrum management, but there are other things too, like being able to trade spectrum and sort of doing Cosian bargaining across lines. So if there's a disruptive change, there's ways. So making this decision doesn't put it in place for all time if you have some other forms of flexibility, which the technology with software-defined radios and some things like that are providing us. Now, having said that, of course, there's some challenges too, but I wouldn't want to leave the impression that once you make this decision, it can't be varied or accommodate new technologies. In fact, the Commission's done a pretty good job of being technologically neutral. You get the spectrum. Now, you may want to go back and do your risk thing again a little bit to see if it's changed the risk, but to me, we're focusing a little bit too narrowly on just the risk assessment.
Yeah, and maybe one way to answer your question is, maybe I feel like I'm seeing examples of it actually working towards that way. And maybe I'll point out the 3.5 gigahertz innovation band, and there's 3 types of licenses that are being anticipated, and I mean, maybe that's something that you could touch on, or others, where there's different types of users. You know, there's still I understand there's intent to auction some of it off, but there's 150 megahertz of spectrum. It's a lot of spectrum. And there's room for maybe some unlicensed use of it, or, you know, and then the licensed, paid for use, and then something in the middle. That is powerful. And I think it leaves I think that's an example of maybe it's actually trending that way.
We have, yeah, there's a question back there.
This is Greg. I had actually sort of a related question for Shawn, which is, you design systems, and how would changing the FCC from sort of this into more of a QRA system affect how you design systems, and would you design flexibility into your systems more because of a change in the ruling or not?
Great question. I think there's a group in between, at least one group in between, which is the device manufacturers. So I feel like I've been too far downstream from a lot of those decisions. So the spectrum's set aside, and then you have maybe IEEE that gets involved in some other industry groups that create some, and then you have the equipment vendors that are making the devices, and then I come in and, wait, why did you do that? Well, no, it's you know, the decision's already made. You can't change that. And you mentioned something around software-defined radio. Wow, you know, maybe there are some things that could change now. For me, I look at, because I'm pretty far downstream of that, I only have so many things to make use of. There's all this license stuff that I kind of maybe say that doesn't apply to me. Outside of maybe two cases. I was in the business of providing indoor cellular connectivity, but I'm not the cell provider. But I had to make sure I could repeat the signal or reproduce it in a way where it's really kind of, I'm just in the middle, because your cell phone provider you're going to hold them accountable. I want to be out of that process as much as I can, but it's our building, so you know there's a lot I had to do for that. And then there's this wireless medical telemetry system that, and Paul Sherman says to say hello, you were part of that. And so think about a wireless frequency domain that was set aside in the U.S. or North America for hospitals to take the sickest of patients, send that telemetry data for the patient vital signs back to a nursing station, and to do analytics and learning alarm, continuous monitoring, huge clinical value. Well, that's really probably the only licensed band that we would deal with, outside of maybe some two-way radio stuff, but pretty hands-off on it. Everything I deal with is largely unlicensed, and I would say maybe one, in terms of, I'm watching this innovation band very closely, and because here's a spectrum opportunity with the right other guidance and usage regulations that I might be able to buy a device like this. So this is I can put any cell phone chip SIM into this, and I can make this phone Verizon, I can make it AT&T, I can make it Sprint or whatever. Or in the 3.5 band, maybe the enterprise, maybe I could put up my own LTE equipment. There's people making stuff now that I might be able to buy. I could put my own SIM in here. Now, well, I've normally just been relegated to Wi-Fi for anything of any decent performance, to now a whole set of devices that are available out there that I might be able to be my own carrier, inside a building. Huge opportunities there, right? You think about, now it changes the game, and it would give me some spectrum to leverage that I would argue is pretty protected in a lot of ways. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Good. So thank you very much to this panel. We're at our break. This panel has teed up the final panel, which will begin in about 15 minutes, so be back for that.
Thank you, Joel.
Oh, thank you.
This is holding together a group this diverse and keeping the conversation going.
Thank you.
That was a great job.
Great input. Thank you.